A very, very great leader once said about his own country, for decades, nothing seems to happen. And then, in a few weeks, decades happen. We're building in the United States to a kind of tension and a kind of explosion that is going to take people by surprise. I think that Americans are getting close to recognizing that the problem here isn't this or that law, this or that politician, this or that party, this or that regulation, that there is slowly coming to the head a recognition that, you know, we live in an economic system. That's the problem. Everybody in this system is playing more or less by the rules. Sure, there are a few people who bend the rules, there always are. But the bankers are doing what is profitable for a banker to do. And the worker is doing the best he or she can to make a living for themselves. Everybody is doing what the system urges them to do, following the rewards and punishments, but the end result is no good. And so what begins to have to happen is difficult. The recognition that it's the system that has to be changed. That, I think, is what's happening. We're coming slowly to do a kind of eureka moment.
What do you think the effect of the Occupy Wall Street movement was on raising the consciousness of this nation to economic disparity?
Well, it goes back to that quotation. Sometimes for decades nothing happens, and then in a few weeks, decades happen. Occupy Wall Street is one of those, in a few weeks, decades happen. Here we had, starting with the crisis in 2007, coming through to 2011, which is when Occupy begins. All over Europe, as this crisis unfolds, unions declare strikes, people go into the streets, general strikes are created. The people in Europe are fighting to make sure that this is not burdening them. The crisis that they didn't cause and whose bailouts bypass them is not now going to be paid for by them. Mm-hmm. They're not going to allow it. Mm-hmm. America sit quiet, nothing. Everybody wonders, well, why are the American people not doing that? Why aren't they fighting? Why aren't they protesting? And the answer is, in a sense, ironically underscored by Occupy. Because suddenly, out of apparently nowhere, in an unbelievably short amount of time, the whole country explodes. Occupy becomes front page news. The autumn of 2011 and into early 2012, you had polls showing that the majority of Americans sympathized with Occupy Wall Street. The government got very frightened and had to shut them down by literally destroying the parks where they had set up their tents and so on. You had a sign that the right combination of protest, and remember, the Occupy was the originator of the 1% versus 99% slogan, a brilliant way to summarize a lot of complicated information in an easy to understand story. Everybody uses 1%, 99%. Even government statistical offices now organize their work this way. So they had an enormous impact. They were a flash. They're still there and they're important, but they were the first wave. The next wave will come. It may be called Occupy Wall Street, it may be something else. But you cannot contain in this country a society that has been built on the notion that every working person has an entitlement to something called an American dream. That if you go to school and you get a degree, or even if you don't, but you work hard, you will get a decent home, a decent income, the ability to give your kids an education, to have a vacation. These things are being taken away from a population that had them in large part, and that was told that even if they didn't have them, they're coming. They're coming to you, work a little harder. The sense of betrayal, the sense of anger is sitting there just below the surface.
I was at the climate change rally.
On the 17th
rally, on the
February.
17th.
Right.
And there was a former police chief, Ray Lewis, there. He was in his police chief's uniform, and he was holding a sign that said, "Warning, massive civil disobedience is next." I mean, what will spark change? Because the system is untenable. So we're either going to go to fascism, or we're going to have some sort of change.
Right. And I
I think people will be stunned if we go to fascism.
Well, I
Just
think there are
stunned.
people planning for it.
Yeah.
I think it would be naive to think that the Patriot Acts 1 and 2, all of the curtailments of civil liberties that we're seeing, supported by Republicans and Democrats in the majority, not all, but in the majority, are much more focused on what might happen at home than any threat from out there. You always say the threat is from outside because you can't face what it would mean if you're actually planning for that at home. But I think when that police chief carries that sign, he's echoing what police chiefs across the United States have been talking about for years now, the danger from inside. You look at Europe and you see a level of social unrest coming out of the same economic crisis we have here. It would be unspeakably naive to imagine that somehow it's not going to cross the ocean. I mean, it's just silly. And then you have Occupy Wall Street, which shows you what had happened. I don't think you can ever know what sparks it. If you had said to me in the summer of 2011 that in September a bunch of people would set up tents in Zuccotti Park in New York, and that would be I would have laughed at you. Mm-hmm. I would have said, everybody would look at them as they were strange. Why are they in a tent in a park? Mm-hmm. But in our society, you never know what tinder, what match, what little inadvertent act starts the explosion. And then I think you're right, and it's very important that people understand this. It will have a right-wing direction, it will have a left-wing. Let me give you an example of a country that shows us our future. The country is Greece. Mm-hmm. And the reason I think it shows us part of our future is because it's subject to the same crisis we're facing here, but it's a small and relatively poor country, and the crisis has hit there on a devastating scale. And unemployment, for example, is 27.5% as we speak. That is not only 3.5 times what it is in this country, it's worse than our worst in the Great Depression. It's an unspeakable. The unemployment for young people 30 years of age and under in Greece, is over 50%. For the first time in a long time, significant numbers of young people in Greece are leaving Greece to go to other countries, which is a long history of Greece as a poor country, which is why there are big communities of Greek Americans and Greek French people and so forth. But when people leave your country, you can know how serious the situation is. Let's take a look at what happened there as a sign of what's going to happen here. One, Greece had, like we have in the country, two major political parties. The New Democracy Party, called right of center, and the Greek Socialist Party, a little bit left of center, not very socialist. They exchanged prime ministers. One, just like we exchanged Republicans and Democrats. Together, the two parties got 2/3 of the vote, election after election. All the little radical parties, left and right, got 2% or 3%. They were there. Not like the United States. They're there, but they're very small. The crisis keeps building. The Greeks don't react. They're 1%, keep a lid on, cut jobs. That's why the unemployment is so bad.
What they're doing here.
Doing what they're doing here, but worse. In 2012, you could see where that leads and where I think it's leading here. First, in the two elections that they held, national elections in 2012, the two big parties that had dominated Greek politics for decades, together got less than 35% of the vote. Suddenly, the mass of Greek people said to the two major parties, can you imagine here in the United States, the mass of people saying to the Republicans and the Democrats, no,
we're done.
We're done with you. Greece had a left-wing party called the Syriza party. It would be getting 2, 3, 4% of the vote. It took a very strong stand against austerity, that the way out of this crisis is not to lay off Greek workers and is not to cut government spending, the opposite. What you might actually call an FDR Roosevelt program from the 30s. And they were critical of capitalism as a system, seeing it as a failure. So they took a strong position. They're now the #1 party by all polls in Greece. They went from 3 or 4%, they're now getting 30%. If an election were held today, and if the poll numbers show up as votes, those are ifs, then they would be the dominant new voice. The left captured in Greece the majority anger and upset of the people. This frightened the folks at the top even more. So they're now supporting a right-wing alternative. It's called in Greece the Golden Dawn Party. And here's the important lesson for us. What do they say is the cause of Greek problems? Is it capitalist
No, of course
world
not.
economy?
Yes.
Is it the behavior of their corporations? Is it the tax evasion of their rich? No. It's all immigrants. The problem for Greece are the Africans, the Eastern Europeans, the Middle Easterners that come into Greece, and there are plenty of them, although for historical different reasons, but they attack them in the street, they invade their homes, it's very violent, but they are saying to the Greek people, the solution is to get rid of the foreigner, to get rid of the immigrant. So that's the right-wing, and they carefully say, that'll solve our problems. We don't have to question capitalism, and we shouldn't. We don't have to tax rich people. We don't. The Tea Party is the rough right-wing equivalent. It has in it people who are racist. It has people in it who are anti-immigrant. That's not all the people. There are people in there for many different reasons. There are complicated coming together. There are all kinds of people on the Occupy Wall Street who have very different motives and very different ideas about what they're doing. I think what they all have in common, for all their different reasons, even if what comes out of their mouth is something about immigrants or something about black people or something like that, that isn't actually the problem for most of them. They aren't particularly upset by race or even by immigrants. They're upset about what's happening in their lives. Their jobs are either gone or insecure or being deprived of benefits. What they can give their children, whom they promised the American dream to, is, sorry, I can't do it, which is very painful. They're facing pressures and upset, and they're turning every which way to try to find a way out. And of course, in America, it's much easier to go in a right-wing direction because it's socially acceptable relative to a left-wing. So we shouldn't be surprised if people find their way into a Tea Party way of articulating their upset. It's the job of the other wing of politics, the left wing, to come up, as Occupy Wall Street did, with another way of understanding and responding to the same upset. We might even imagine, in a wonderful world, that there might even be coming together of an Occupy and a Tea Party saying, hey,
That's what I was thinking.
we do have something in common. We disagree about some of these things, but we want a kind of change that helps the average. And you could see both Romney and Obama, in a sense, trying to do that by talking in the election about the middle class that's disappearing or the middle class that's under attack. That was a way of trying to talk to everybody by saying something about what they were feeling, even though what both parties proposed to deal with it cannot and will not adequately cope with this situation. I, as an economist, small point, I, as an economist, sit down with people on the left, on the right, and in the middle, and they disagree about how we got into this crisis, and they disagree about how to get out of it. But here's one thing there's almost no disagreement about. This is the worst economic crisis in our lifetimes, and it is being handled in a way that is despicable, unsupportable, and tragic in where it's leading.